It's a great pleasure to have our guest this week is Dr. Henry Marsh. But Henry, it's great to have you back, and it's fantastic to hear you again.
Good morning. It really is a great joy to be back in Dublin again, which truly is one of my favourite cities. So, one of the nice things about writing a bestseller is you get fan mail. And I got a letter some years ago now from somebody called Dr. Linda Hill, who runs the public health training program in the University of San Diego, Southern California. And she wrote saying how there was in the States there's an 80-hour working week for the residents, which personally I think is more or less correct rather than the mad European Working Time Directive. And the head of neurosurgery came to the committee which was implementing the 80-hour week rule and said neurosurgeons are different. We can't have this 80-hour week for neurosurgeons. And when asked why, when the committee asked why an exemption should be made to neurosurgery, he replied, because neurosurgeons are superior humans, mentally, physically, and sexually. And she says, it's true. She says, you can't make this up, is what she said. And I must confess, when I started training as a neurosurgeon in 1980, I didn't think it was sex or bit, no, but I did think there was something really very special about neurosurgery. And I saw surgery as being all about knowledge, experience, and heroic individuals. And you probably know Cushing in the top left-hand corner. And there you have the future neurosurgeon, Henry Marsh, wearing a white coat at the bottom. And really my life ever since then has been a long lesson in being disabused of this view of neurosurgery. Now we all know that medicine is dangerous. As surgeons, the fact of the matter is that is what draws us to it. Although when we're young, you don't realise there's a danger to us as well as to our patients. And particularly what interests me in recent years is the philosophical concept of what's called moral harm. But I'm not going to talk about that. But you might know in 1999, this health institute in America published the first big report showing that actually an awful lot of danger in medicine is avoidable, iatrogenic damage, and many, many reports since then have confirmed this. And I want to talk to you about two questions. The first question is how to minimize mistakes and avoidable harm to patients. And secondly, equally importantly, how can we establish trust with patients and their families so that if or when things go wrong, we don't get into trouble. Now, I used to be very sniffy about comparing aviation safety to surgery. I said, no, flying an aeroplane is quite different from what I do as a brain surgeon. This is ridiculous. But then I read this, and as you know, aviation safety has become incredibly safe compared to, let's say, the 1960s and 1970s. Flying an aeroplane, slightly counterintuitively, is now one of the safest ways of traveling, even though it's wrecking the planet in the process. And he illustrates, the book really is about the way success in so many areas of life is based on failure, and above all, learning from failure. And he illustrates this with one or two iconic plane crashes. There was a famous Korean crash in '97 when a Boeing jumbo jet was coming into land in bad conditions on the island of Guam in the Pacific, and the ground radar was being serviced and wasn't working. The senior pilot thought he was higher up than he was. And on the black box recorder, you can hear the co-pilot saying 200 meters, 150 meters, 100 meters, 50 meters, and then they're all dead. I think one air stewardess survived on the tail of the plane. And then there was another crash in 1978 when the landing gear didn't light up. And the pilot got so worked up about this, trying to work out whether the landing gear was down or not, despite his engineer's warnings in the days when they had an engineer in the plane, and they ran out of fuel and crashed. And there were some survivors, including the pilot, who committed suicide some years later. So going back to the Korean Airlines, what did they conclude? Well, they concluded that co-pilots should speak up and that senior pilots should listen to them. In other words, what's called cabin crew training, which is a vital part of aviation safety. In other words, it's teamwork, a word which has become greatly damaged, certainly in England in the NHS, where teamwork means sitting in boring meetings, talking about working and not working, and being bossed about by managers who don't understand what they're doing, what we do. And what did I conclude? Well, I concluded that highly skilled, highly trained pilots can make the most terrible mistakes. And surgeons are no different. And I've made terrible mistakes, and I've made a bit of a career since retirement talking about them, which is actually quite painful. But there is, of course, a vital difference between pilot safety and surgical safety. The pilot's probably going to be killed. So you actually have a personal interest in making the flight as safe as possible. Whereas as surgeons, we have to live with our mistakes. We then face the moral problem of how we cope with that. And this wonderful quotation from Le Riche, the French vascular surgeon, a bit of a Nazi actually during the war apparently. He was a bit of a collaborator. I'll read it because it's so good. Every surgeon carries within himself a small cemetery to which he must go from time to time to contemplate. It's a place full of bitterness and regret, a place where he must look for an explanation for his failures. So, error in medicine. There are many forms of it, but first of all, there's carelessness. We would say it's purely careless, and I once started an operation on the wrong side, which I'll discuss later. And then there are what the psychologists call cognitive biases in decision-making and estimating probabilities, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And there's the Swiss cheese model, which I'm sure you've heard about, and is very true, and there's also sheer ignorance. The Swiss cheese model, as you know, is the idea you can have a series of minor mistakes, which, if they're lined up badly, so to speak, you can end up with a catastrophe at the end of it. That's a totally benign brain tumour, a meningioma growing off the falx. I'm afraid my examples are going to be neurosurgical, inevitably. Lots of cerebral edema, the white around the blob in the middle, definitely a benign tumour. Was a 57-year-old diabetic Korean woman who didn't speak much English. She was, in fact, a cosmetic beautician and did the fingernails for my colleague, the professor of, who's a woman professor of cardiac surgery in my hospital. And she referred her to me. And she presented with personality change, because it's the front of the brain, and becoming confused, which obviously was hard to assess because she didn't speak much English. So it's a benign tumour, would prove fatal in time. That definitely needed to be removed. Fairly standard policy, they're not very strongly evidence-based. You start high-dose steroids several days in advance when there's so much edema. Because when you remove the tumour, you won't create that much extra space, and the brain will swell around it, and that can be disastrous. So I asked a family doctor to put her on steroids a few days in advance, but said, she's diabetic, please watch her diabetes carefully, because dexamethasone will screw it up. She comes into surgery on a Sunday evening in the highly efficient modern NHS. We bring the patients in at very short notice, having seen them as outpatients in the anaesthetic clinic beforehand. Being a nice chap, I always went in to see my patients the night before surgery because I lived near the hospital. I was held up, it was 10 o'clock at night, she was very sleepy, didn't speak much. And I said, well, it's late at night and she's a bit knocked off by the tumour anyway. And my anaesthetist saw her for the first time next morning, also noted she was very sleepy, but thought, well, it's a tumour, etc., etc. She's anaesthetised, blood gas is checked routinely. She's in hyperosmolar ketotic coma, which we've missed. So the operation's abandoned, she's on the ICU, she dies. So what do we think about that? Well, she didn't have her blood glucose checked on the night of admission, and that's how it all those things lined up, all those bits of Swiss cheese lined up to produce a totally avoidable death for a completely benign tumour. Who is to blame? Oh, me, the GP, who didn't check the steroids, me for not thinking carefully when I saw her, my anaesthetist, or that terrible nurse who didn't check her blood glucose. Now, if there's one message from the patient safety movement, it is this: that is the wrong question to ask. What you should say is what went wrong, because the fundamental insight of all this is that most medical error occurs because of bad systems that fail to allow for human error, not bad individuals. And I almost certainly, the night of her admission, they were short-staffed. There was an agency nurse. They were run off their feet, and that's why the blood glucose wasn't checked. The problem was the system, but they didn't have enough staff on at night, and they didn't do things properly. And if you read that very nice book by Gawande, the American surgical writer, as he says very succinctly, the problem is not stopping bad doctors making mistakes, but stopping good doctors making mistakes. Now, cognitive biases. The great man Danny Kahneman, who died a couple of years ago, got the Nobel Prize for economics, although he was a psychologist. It's rather heavy going, the book. But it's all about the fact when we have to estimate probabilities, we consistently tend to make mistakes because we're unconsciously biased by preconceptions and emotional involvement. He uses the analogy, although this is more hardwired, of the Muller-Lyer optical illusion, whereby however hard you look at those two lines, we see them as being of different length, even though they're not. And we have these built-in tendencies to be biased in the way we think, cognitive, and above all, estimating probabilities. And there are many of these. One is the so-called halo effect. You can show if people think well of somebody for one particular way, they'll tend to overestimate their abilities in other areas. This is a big problem for senior surgeons, where if you're a good trainer, you have to delegate some of the operating to your trainees. If you don't, they'll never learn. And you have to gradually grade that, so you give them more and more operating on their own. You gradually, first of all, you're scrubbed up with them, then you're standing beside them, then you're in the surgical sitting room next door, then you're in the office downstairs. A gradual process, and it has to be based on trust. And I made quite a few mistakes in my early years as a consultant. When I wanted to be liked by my trainees, I liked them, and I can think of several patients who died or came to terrible harm because I left too much of an operation, particularly at the critical opening. I was just thinking about this last week when I was lecturing at a European Pediatric Neurosurgical Society meeting, and now one of the most senior European pediatric neurosurgeons, very nice guy, works at Great Ormond Street, was one of my trainees, and years ago I left him to open a big meningioma in a young man, and he got the flap slightly in the wrong place. It was over the midline, over the sagittal sinus, which I wasn't there at the time. And when I came in to do the operation, I cut through the sagittal sinus because I didn't realize it was there. You can't see it. And the patient bled to death perioperatively. It's a rare event. And that, in retrospect, you might say I was careless, I was stupid, but it was a sort of halo effect. I'd failed to judge properly what my trainee was up to doing, capable of doing, because I liked him too much, you know. As a trainer, you have to be detached and reasonable and fair. And then there's the availability heuristic, which is a bit of a mouthful, but basically what that means is our probability of an event happening, and all medicine is about estimating probabilities. What will happen if I don't operate? What will happen if I do operate? It's a problem with private medicine. If you know you're going to make money from treating a patient, unconsciously, you very probably, you're not wrong, but you'll probably overestimate the risks of doing nothing and underestimate the risks of surgery. That's an example of cognitive bias. But the emotional consequences of a similar event in the past will distort your judgment. If you're an obstetrician and the last breech came to grief, you probably will have an exaggeratedly low threshold for doing a caesarean section next time. That's a Chiari malformation. They're often asymptomatic, very rarely a sort of dangerous condition, unless it causes a syrinx in the spinal cord, then it's a bit different. But it can be highly symptomatic with impulse headaches. And that was a young woman with a straightforward Chiari. Technically, the operation is pretty easy. You just remove bone from around the foramen magnum at the base of the skull. You may or may not open the dura, depending on your philosophy. And I'd done many of his operations by then. I hadn't had any serious complications. There's about a 10% risk of a fairly mild aseptic meningitis from CSF getting into the muscles after the operation. And the operation went very well. To compound the problem, one of my colleagues was also doing a Chiari malformation decompression next door, And I went round to see it, and he was making a mess of it. His brain was swollen. I thought, gosh, yeah, I'm so much better than he is. Patient went home 2 days later, which was pretty good going. Came back 10 days later ill, in an odd sort of way. I couldn't quite understand it. She was clearly septic, but awake, a very high blood pressure. I got a brain scan, and I looked at that scan, and I was so blinded, it's called inattentional blindness, but also by my availability heuristic, I was just not expecting a deadly complication. If you look at that, it's obvious the cerebellum is squeezing out of the back of the bony decompression. There is black stuff around the brainstem. I mean, it's a complication I've never seen before and never saw again. It was a postoperative subdural empyema. And I was so thrown by this, I didn't see that immediately. And I hesitated for 24 hours before re-exploring the wound. And she was left completely wrecked as a result. So that's an example where what I was looking at, I couldn't see it. I was so blinded both by my anxiety and the availability heuristic. What should I have done? If I'd shown that scan to one of my colleagues, he'd have said, Henry, look, he wouldn't have had my cognitive biases. So, and that's another example. It's a child in Ukraine where I still operate regularly. I did some operating on kids in a hospital in Lviv. The operation before that had gone wonderfully well, so I thought everything was fine. I then helped my colleagues do a malignant medulloblastoma. The operation went fine. She went off to what was called intensive care, and when I came in next morning, she was comatose, locked in with that great big post-operative hemorrhage. And it turned out she hadn't really had proper intensive care at all. She had no proper analgesia. She'd become hypertensive and bled. So that again is a sort of example of an availability heuristic. I've been lulled into a false sense of security, but also an element, which I'll talk about later, of groupthink. I didn't want to rock the boat by saying, look, what is your intensive care really going to be like? I should have gone there, talked to the doctors, but I didn't want to sort of upset their feelings by questioning their abilities. And she died horribly locked in after the operation. So what does Kahneman tell us about human error generally in cognitive biases? And it applies so much to medicine. Well, we'll be less subject to cognitive biases if we think slowly and carefully, which often I didn't, because I'm a rather impetuous, impatient person. They're hopefully not when actually operating. And there's one of my heroes, Gillis, the founder of plastic surgery, said, it's a very good book written by a non-medic, Lindsay Fitzharris, about all his work in the First World War, these terrible facial injuries you get with modern munitions, which we're seeing again tragically in Ukraine now. He said, never do today what will wait until tomorrow. I mean, certainly if you want to operate, get our hands in, but slow down, think slowly, a la Kahneman, is a lesson if I could take my former self by the collar and give it a good shake. And above all, by understanding that other people are better at seeing my mistakes than I am. We all have this built-in prejudice. We think we're good. We have to. And particularly if you do very dangerous surgery, you have to have high self-esteem. But, we have to understand we're not good at criticizing ourselves. Good colleagues are ideally better at doing that job, and we're better at seeing their mistakes than they are. And that's called teamwork. And teamwork really is about having good colleagues. And the first rule of teamwork is if you're not a good colleague yourself, you certainly won't have good colleagues. I mean, it's necessary, as the philosophers say, but not sufficient. You may still have shits as colleagues. But if you're not a good colleague yourself, you're not, it's very unlikely you'll end up with a good team. So teamwork for surgeons, constructive criticism, helping each other, not necessarily in competition, but essentially having a shared vision of trying to minimize morbidity, learning from each other's mistakes. And that means meaningful morbidity and mortality meetings. And as I was talking to Ronan Cargill in the car on the way here, it's really very difficult. It's such a simple idea. You discuss all your bad results and draw a conclusion, and everything's fine. But I've sat in on airman meetings all over the world, and they're really very difficult to run well, to get that balance between criticism and support and not blaming. I mean, the English tendency, being English, we are terrified of confrontation. and are all hypocritical. And we say, oh, don't worry, old boy, these things happen, and you brush the complication under the carpet. When I've been sitting in M&M meetings and mistakes, it's all, surgeons criticising each other, throwing mud at each other, and is equally unconstructive. And to find a balance between those two extremes is very difficult. It calls for something called leadership. Teamwork actually is all tied up with leadership, and I'll speak a few words about that later. So openly discussing errors and mistakes and not hiding them. And as I said before, and coming back to Syed's book, we learn more from mistakes and failure than we do from success. In a paradoxical sort of way, success is bad for us. It makes us complacent. Come on. Oh, yeah. I picked that off the internet years ago. It's a rather nice slide showing the modern model of leadership is on the right, where the leader is empowering and supporting the employees. This is a business model, as opposed to the old dictatorial pyramid, which was certainly the system I was brought up in the past. I mean, it's complicated, firstly because leadership carries the burden of responsibility, and secondly, one of the problems certainly in England with the NHS hospitals, I don't do clinical work, but I still lecture regularly and teach in my hospital, is there's nobody in charge. You have all these competing pyramids. You have the surgeons, you have the intensivists, you have the anaesthetists, you have the ICU nurses, you have the physios. They're all sort of equal, and nobody's in charge. The old system, which in a sense was also bad and corrupting, when the senior surgeons had total autonomy. At least things were very efficient. Everybody knew where they stood. So it's complicated to get that balance right. But the problem is, I once gave a lecture in Doha to some huge audience of Middle Eastern doctors, where I was preaching openness and honesty. But you can't really expect openness and honesty from people at the bottom of the system if the people at the top don't show it. And all these Middle Eastern doctors are all working in kleptocracies and hierarchies of one sort or another. So there is this huge obligation on senior doctors to a certain example of honesty, talking about their own errors and mistakes. And if they don't do that, people lower down, you'll never even begin to try to create the ideal of a no-blame culture. And of course, because of litigation, the Anglo-American Irish system of competing lawyers and large sums of money involved, that makes it all the more difficult. I was in Stockholm recently, and my colleague there said, I said, what do you do about consent forms? He said, consent forms? We don't have consent forms. I couldn't believe it, they don't. He said, look, we're a high-trust society. I explain the operation to my patient, we shake hands. And of course, in New Zealand, they have no fault compensation, so there's no medical litigation. So there are other ways of doing it that the system we're cursed with. I mean, in England now, I know Ireland is quite litigious, but in England, the medical legal costs are going up and up and up. 3% of the total NHS budget now goes on medical legal expenses, and already the committed payments for the next 20 years is £53 billion is already committed to pay for settlements already made. It's not sustainable, but the wheel goes on careering into the future. And now you can illustrate this problem of openness above by saying, if the top level eyes look down, they see only shit, and the ones at the bottom only see ourselves. That's the bad leadership model. Now, there are some problems with teamwork, and one of the biggest problems is the surgical ego. If you remember Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and the evil stepmother, mirror, mirror on the wall. And surgeons were all a bit like that. Am I the best? Is somebody up the road a bit better than me? Particularly when we're young surgeons, we're all very aware of the fact we're not that good, because we're not that experienced, and yet we have to pretend to patients we know what we're talking about. I mean, the doctor-patient relationship is not a rational transaction. The only sensible question as a patient you should ask a surgeon is, how many of these operations have you done? And what are your results? This is what you'd ask somebody selling you a car. Only once or twice in my career was I asked that question. Because patients don't dare to do that. They mean, I don't trust you. And as a result, as doctors, we're all pretending, and we often end up pretending to ourselves, but we feel jealous and threatened by the very real possibility other people may be doing better than we are. And if you say to a patient, yes, I can do this operation, and in fact you know there's somebody else who's done more than you have, this is an example of the moral harm we suffer. We have to lie to some extent. If I don't take on the difficult cases as a young consultant, how will I ever get any better? Of course, teamwork, if you have a good department, may well get around that problem. But you have to understand that jealousy, insecurity is a driving force in most surgical personalities. Because our patients put us in pedestals. That's Hunter, John Hunter at the Royal College in Lincoln's Inn Fields in London. And they hope we have godlike powers. And we have to fight that off. And as Lord Acton famously said, all power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And then another problem with team working, which is not a panacea by any means, is what's called groupthink, as the psychologists call it. A group can easily make decisions that the members of a group would not make on their own. And as I said earlier, a good team practices constructive disagreement, is not harmony above all else. That's a difficult tumour, a cerebellar hemangioblastoma. There are massive blood vessels. They're the only time in brain surgery, with the exception perhaps of renal metastases, where you do an en bloc resection. I mean, the classic way of removing a brain tumour is you devascularize it on the outside, you then debulk it and gradually collapse it in, away from the surrounding brain, blood vessels, cranial nerves, etc. But if you go into a hemangioblastoma, typically the patient will leave the operating theatre in a coffin. So when they're particularly down there over the brainstem at the foramen magnum, they're difficult cases, and I've done a few, and with acceptable results. There's no major morbidity. But this was shortly after I'd retired from full-time work. My job had been taken by an outstanding trainee of mine who's doing brilliantly now. This is now 10 years ago. And at the multidisciplinary team neuro-oncology meeting, this case was presented, had been admitted under my colleague. And he was a bit worried about operating and said, well, it'll be a very difficult operation. And the radiotherapist, who shouldn't have said this, said, well, we can treat it with radiotherapy, which actually is not really the case. But anyway, that's what they said. Now, I said, look, I think that's surgical. But I didn't insist, because I didn't want to upset. I didn't want my colleague to feel I was accusing him of being a bit of a coward. I didn't want to sort of rock the boat with the radiotherapist. So I just muttered, said, look, you know, I could operate. But I should have put my foot down and said, look, I will remove that, because I know I can. It's not safe, but I still thought it was safer than radiotherapy. Radiotherapy was an unknown entity for a tumour that size, of that sort. So the patient has radiotherapy, it all goes horribly wrong, he ends up in surgery, he's ended up in a minimally conscious state, having been totally well beforehand. So that's an example of groupthink, an example of how if your MDTs are always full of agreement and peace and quiet, they're bad meetings. Checklists. I was opposed to aviation safety. I was opposed to the WHO checklist when it was introduced many years ago. I have problems with a checklist. I think it's one size fits all is a bad thing. If you want people to use paperwork properly, they should be involved in it. I was impressed when I went to the MD Anderson in Houston, but there in the neurosurgical department, they'd produced their own checklists. So all the doctors and nurses and staff were stakeholders, they were involved, they'd chosen it. It was not imposed from outside. And so I was grumbling about this in a sort of consultant, neurosurgical, self-important way, on the wrong side. I'd started an occipital glioma on the right side, and it should have been on the left side. Interestingly enough, is not that I knew which side the tumour was on. I got confused between my own right and left side. You turn the patient upside down, face down on the table. And then my assistant, my senior registrar, presumably thought I knew what I was doing. It was all right, I roused a mistake. But the patient came back to the ICU with a strange W, also M-shaped incision like that. And I explained it all to him and his wife, and they forgave me. I couldn't very well, I could have pretended, I suppose. But why was I opposed to the checklist? Well, self-importance, but not wanting to think critically of myself, not wanting to think I might make such a basic mistake as operating on the wrong side. And believe me, it's easily done. So although I think checklists have their limits, I, again, as the reformed Henry Marsh, accepts the need for them, though I wish it was done better than it is done at the moment in my department. And I say to my former self and to anybody here who doubts the occasional value of checklists, do you want your pilots to use checklists or not? And obviously we all say yes. You know. But it's because of this sort of conspiracy that our patients, we have to have this patience, this deep irrational faith in doctors, that this rubs off on us. And we find it hard to confront the fact that what we do is so dangerous and so open to error and mistakes. Now, most malpractice litigation is always said arises from poor communication. There's a problem with informed consent, and that's difficult because when you get consent for an operation, it's not just about listing, well, it shouldn't be just about listing all the things that can go wrong. But you're kind of trying to give hope to the patient as well, and to get that balance right between being realistic, but at the same time being positive. And again, you make decisions with patients, not for them. But to get that balance right is difficult. And one of the biggest problems about communication is, although nowadays medical students get a certain amount of teaching in communication, patients never tell us afterwards how we did. And if an operation goes well, you can be extremely rude to patients, but they love you nevertheless, because the operation was a success. But I had to have endless, being the nature of neurosurgery, I had endless horrible conversations, mainly with families, saying the person you love is going to die or be left terribly brain damaged. They wouldn't ring me up next day and say, Mr. Marsh, you were great, Mr. Marsh, you were terrible. So we're kind of learning in a vacuum. And to learn how to do something where you get no feedback is very difficult. And I suspect most of us think we're better at talking to patients than we really are. But it's very hard to know. I said in England with GP training, they have video cameras with the patient's agreement, and you'll see yourself talking to patients in general practice. And it's very good seeing yourself on video. As a sort of public speaker and film star, I've often seen myself on video. And it's very useful. It's a very good way of doing things. I often muttered about introducing that to a neurosurgical outpatient clinic, but alas, never did. But it is difficult to get that balance right between being positive and honest at the same time when it's very serious surgery. And of course, when things do go badly, poor explanation and the doctor not caring or being in denial when things go badly is a huge source of litigation and resentment. I like to say the management of surgical complications begins the moment you meet the patient for the first time, either at the bedside or in the outpatient clinic. How you create trust is very difficult, but incredibly important. And it's not about, when things go badly, bursting into tears and sobbing on the patient's shoulder, but to appear offhand that actually your patient's life or well-being doesn't really matter that much to you is terrible. And as I said, with the wrong side operation, it is extraordinary what you get forgiven for. And one of the most moving events in my life, I've already talked about one per-operative death. They're very, very unusual. But my other per-operative death was a 9-year-old child with a malignant glioma. So the outlook was awful. You could almost say, why operate? But she bled to death during the operation. It was an incredibly vascular tumour, which I was not expecting. And although I'd warned the mother all about risks and malignancy, I hadn't said she's going to come back out of the theatre dead. And I had to go upstairs and then tell the mother. And she could see I was terribly upset. When you've got a dead body at the end of the operation, stitching up the head of a corpse, it's awful. And the whole atmosphere in the operating theatre is so distressing. And the mother took me in her arms and consoled me. And I thought, that's extraordinary. So you do occasionally have these very profound moments. But if you don't care, I suppose you can pretend to care. There's one study suggesting doctors with fake empathy do better than those who have empathy or so. I don't know. But it's difficult. And I do think we're all enormously influenced by the department we work in, by our seniors. We tend to even unconsciously imitate the people we work under. And again, it's so important for senior doctors to set an example of kindness and empathy, constrained, limited, not infinite, but you do care. As I said before, we rarely get feedback about communication, which makes it very difficult. Can be taught to some extent at medical schools. Medical students now are taught ICE, something like, expectation, there's a sort of routine for how you're going to be nice. It's a much simpler thing, which I used to do and would teach, is when you first meet a patient, the first question is, what have you been told? What do you understand? What does this mean to you? And that's how you then start the conversation. But the point is that you may have seen these awful cases recently in England of not brain dead, but sort of kids more or less without brains on long-term ventilation, and there's a falling out between the doctors and the parents. Both these parents, Alfie Evans and Charlie Gard, were Catholic families. They wouldn't accept discontinuation of ventilation, and it had to go to the High Court. There was massive publicity, and there were sort of flash mobs outside the Children's Hospital in Liverpool accusing the doctors of being murderers. It was very distressing for everybody. And the government commissioned a report from a Nuffield bioethics lot about this, and they made some sensible, fairly obvious conclusions. But if you have different messages from different members of the healthcare team, this is destructive. But the bit I like is that good communication is not an end in itself. Good communication is a means to building a trusting relationship with patients and their families. And the other point is failing to involve parents as experts in their children's illness, which I would paraphrase as treating patients and their families as your equals. Yes, you have a lot of expert knowledge, you have a lot of responsibility, but do not look down on your patients and their families. So how to avoid trouble? In conclusion, build a trusting relationship with patients and their families, and then when things don't go pear-shaped, you're much less likely to get into trouble, litigation, complaints, and all that stuff, which we all hate. Every time, it wasn't that often, I got a letter, a complaint, and you really feel the world's coming to an end. It's a very, very unpleasant feeling. Because our relationship with patients is all about trust, and to feel that trust has somehow broken down is horribly painful. And be a good colleague, and hope to have good colleagues. And ultimately be profoundly self-critical. We must not trust ourselves as much as our patients trust us. And think slowly. Ask for help. I'm often asked, what is your advice to the young doctors? And I say, ask for help. And there are so many cases at all levels, almost all the stages of my career, until the last 10 years or so, where if I'd asked for help, things would have gone better. And use checklists where appropriate. Thank you very much.